I've got some questions about what happens to a physician who is potentially charged with violations of state and federal law. So, Jonathan, can you tell us what are the typical charges? What are the typical sentences? How does this kind of play out in real life?
Well, it's going to be a very different scenario in state and federal court. In federal court, and honestly, these things are typically dealt with in federal court because U.S. attorneys' offices are built to deal with these kinds of crimes, whereas your typical state attorney's office, they're really not built to deal with large-scale investigations like this. So if someone is charged in federal court with something to do with this, they could be charged with Medicare fraud, so any number of different types of fraud, wire fraud. They could be charged with false statements. They could be charged with violations of the anti-kickback law.
So does this typically start out with an investigation, for example, of the DME company who's, offering the services or the equipment, and then sort of filters down to the physician? How does this all get started?
Actually, it typically starts with the physician as opposed to the DME company, because what happens is, typically speaking, is a person will receive some piece of DME that they didn't ask for, they didn't want, they don't need, and their insurance or Medicare or whatnot will be billed for that, and then they will report that to law enforcement or the Department of Health, and then an investigation is started specifically into that physician rather than the company, because people don't think about this through the framework of, this is like there's some large corporate entity that has structured itself in order to do this. They think about bad doctors.
Okay.
So there is, typically speaking, what it starts with is actually in administrative investigation by the Department of Health and that board. So typically, the board of medicine, board of osteopathic medicine, whatever the case may be, and they will do their own investigation. Depending on the case, then the sanctions may not be horrible in that scenario. But what may happen after that would be a part of a larger federal investigation. And if that becomes part of a larger federal investigation, then a physician can get caught up, in a conspiracy case, in a RICO case. There could be, or just have straightforward charges of, again, various forms of fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, kickback violations, false statements, potentially money laundering, depending on the scope of the situation.
So you talked a little bit about the typical charge. So this start with like a knock on the doctor's door at their house saying, what are you doing? What's this initial contact, and how do we get from that to a criminal charge?
Once a criminal investigation has been started, if it's a federal investigation, then yes, the first thing that's going to happen is probably going to be a knock on the door, and that will be a federal agent who will be delivering a letter to an individual that's called a target letter. It is a letter that says, in pretty plain terms, from some local Department of Justice office, the United States Attorney's Office, that they are the target of an investigation. And the federal agents are typically well trained in the laws of when someone is in custody and when is not, and actually conduct a fairly thorough investigation where the physician is making all sorts of inculpatory statements, not having no idea that these are going to be used in court against them because they haven't been arrested. Well, no, this is happening at their house. They're sitting, at their coffee table with some federal agent, just chatting. Mm-hmm. And then before you know it, they've made, just monumental, confessions and admissions to these kinds of things. So it starts with a knock at the door and a letter, and frankly, a lot of the time physicians, are again, very, very bright people, and they think I haven't done anything wrong, and they will ignore it, and just think this is going to go away. And I've explained all this, rather than contacting a lawyer with these letters will typically actually suggest to them. And the letter will actually say, like this is your chance to talk to us. If you don't do so, we're going to charge you with X, Y, or Z. And many times physicians ignore these things. They don't get the letter and think, okay, I've got a real problem. Let me find a lawyer who's competent to deal with this kind of thing and figure this out. They think I haven't done anything wrong, and they ignore it, which is the worst possible thing that anyone, especially a physician in these circumstances, can do. If you're contacted by a federal agent, if you're contacted by an investigator from the Florida Department of Health, it's really, really, really important to immediately seek representation by someone who is competent to deal with these kinds of things. Because if you ignore the Department of Health, if you ignore the federal government, what's going to happen eventually at that point is there's going to be charges brought against you where you might have the ability to prevent that if you're dealing with it on the front end. And federal prosecutors make decisions about who they do and who they don't prosecute. Sometimes they prosecute people regardless. Sometimes you can negotiate lesser charges, so someone's not getting the complete book thrown at them. Sometimes they will use a physician or someone else as a witness in a case, even if there has been some sort of violation, and so there is no prosecution against them. But of course, the carrot is were the head of the snake, so to speak, to go to trial. They would be testifying against that person. That is a very common occurrence. But in order to get to that point, you have to be dealing with it affirmatively. If you're not dealing with it affirmatively, you're just opening up Pandora's box.
So what's the typical potential criminal liability and monetary consequences?
There really isn't a typical monetary or criminal liability, because it really depends on the facts. So if somebody is in this situation in state court or federal court, then it really depends on the amount of loss. Is that these kinds of cases, and then to what the sentence is going to be, is driven by a number of things. But of course, the primary thing is the amount of loss that the federal government would have incurred based upon the amount of DME or testing or drugs or whatever that was prescribed by the physician that the federal government paid for in some sense. So if the amount was $50,000, let's say, a physician could still be prosecuted, could still lose his license or her license, but be in a position where they might not get much more than a probationary sentence. That's still a huge problem, since in that scenario, even if the Board of Medicine were to take mercy on a person, you're still in a position where just by virtue of that conviction, you are not able to renew your license for years and years, like 10, 15 years in most cases. So that it's effectively the end of one's career, and you won't be able to go to another state and get licensure there either. It won't happen. So if the larger the number gets, so for instance, if I have a client who is responsible for about 2.7 million in loss to Medicare, TRICARE, et cetera. And in his case, he might not go to jail at all, but he scores about 3 years of prison. And that's after all the machinations are done with the federal sentencing guidelines. And and again, it's important for people to understand that you're not held responsible for the amount of salary necessarily. That's an issue, but what drives the sentencing parameters is the amount of loss to the government, and the physician will almost never be a part of that equation. They don't have any idea what these companies are getting paid by the federal government for this tremendous amount of fraud they're doing.
All right, let's take a quick break, and I want to come back and talk about the impact on the medical license. You made some allusions to that, but I want to expand on that. And then we're going to talk about what it costs once you've dealt with the criminal liability and the fines to defend one of these. So let's take a quick break.